live stream, that would be great.
Okay.
Let me know when we're live.
We're
Yep.
live.
Okay. Good morning, or good afternoon or evening, wherever you are. I just want to welcome everyone to our video conference for April. We have two substantive matters to address today. One is due to the chair's delinquents and over-enthusiasm of ongoing concern approval. In March, I didn't get the formal approval of our minutes from December and February, so we'll deal with that. And then we're going to address our assurance on sustainability report, which will, as you know, we're turning to the introduction and illustrative reports of the proposed IAASB 5000. And at the end of that, assuming we're fine, we will affirm our intention to advance the timeline on consultation to July. All participants have received the agenda papers for this video conference, and notice of this meeting has also been provided to the public. The agenda papers, as always, have been posted on our website. Will be posted on our website, and then I just need to note one: apologies for our meeting due to circumstances beyond his control. Bill Edge had a work conflict and so cannot join us today. We have a few public observers joining us. Janine Van Diegelen from the PIOB, and our official observers, Jim Dowkett, our CAG chair, Yosh Matsumoto for the Japan FSA, and at some point we may be joined by a member of this team from the European Commission. Before we turn to the two business items of the day, I just wanted to give a heads up on the LCE project, partly fueled by the ability to get the ED out for IAASB 5000, and partly because of the progress we've made. The staff and the task force have discussed the way forward on the LCE project, and they now believe, because of the time we're able to devote to it, that we could seek approval of the LCE standard in September. Obviously, this is with all the caveats that we're content with the quality and all the issues have been addressed. So I wanted you to be aware of that fact, and as you read the June papers, that you should be thinking very much with a September approval in mind. I think this one will be useful for the marketplace who's seeking this standard and want additional time to implement the standard. But secondly, it shows that by moving faster on some projects, we'll have all these beneficial knock-on effects. Again, subject to this concept of not diminishing quality at all. The other thing I was neglectful about, and this is a common theme, is that usually we have good new staff announcements to make at board meetings, and I forgot at the last board meeting to announce that Jasper has been promoted to a director as of February this year. So congratulations to Jasper. It's great to have him as part of the leadership team of the technical staff. So let's turn to the minutes if no one has any objections. Now, can we approve the draft minutes for December 2022 and February 7th, 2023? They've been posted. They reflect any comments that have been received. We were really set to go if I had just read my notes properly in March. So by show of hands, could we get an approval of both those minutes? I'm getting some people even giving me hands and thumbs, so that means that people are really enthusiastic. Okay, I think we got everyone to approve them. Any objections?
I just didn't put my hand up because I wasn't at either.
Yeah,
meeting. Yeah.
okay. So noted on that, Greg. So, okay, we'll turn to the first order of business, if no one has an objection. All I want to say is that I wanted to thank the task force for being so responsive to suggestions and incorporating them into these documents. Even though we hadn't even had a full board discussion, I see how the input from the other discussions in March have fed in and been responsive. And I look forward to the discussion today on the introduction and illustrative examples. Josephine, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom. And as always, afternoon from our London studios, my favourite phrase. I'd also like to extend huge thanks to the staff and, of course, the task force members for their agility, in fact, in not only turning around papers for today's meeting, but also the papers are almost ready, if not ready right now, for our task force meeting next week. So we really are in good shape. And that's down to the task force members, staff, and of course the board members as well, working hard to make sure that we all reach our targets of timeliness and quality. So today our focus is on the last remaining section of the standard, so the introduction and scope in Agenda 1A, and of course our illustrative reports in Agenda 1B. Now, in seeking feedback on 1B, we'll also be asking for the board's direction on paragraphs 12B to 13C of the issues paper, and whether it's necessary for the task force to pursue those matters raised in those paragraphs. So I'm just going to really briefly, as always, discuss both Agenda 1A and 1B together before we move on to the questions. Now, with Agenda 1A, you will see from the issues paper that in developing the introduction of scope, we have actually drawn from existing standards and modified as appropriate. But to Tom's point, we've also taken into account the comments we've already received from the board and task force members. So that's, acknowledging that there could be a scenario where framework may be a special purpose framework, describing what sustainability information might be to align it more with IAASB's description and building those bridges. We're bringing in our existing guidance on what is at least as demanding into the introductory text, but also remembering the board's important caution along the way around balance and length of introductory material. We are not obviously trying to write an executive summary here, which is obviously more important for non-authoritative guidance. So we've always kept that in mind. So looking forward to comments on that agenda item. Then with B1, we'll be seeking comments on the 3 illustrative reports. We'll go through each in place. Of course, please do send any editorials offline, particularly if there's something that's going to be in one that works its way through to the other 2. So it's mirrored across all 3, then that would be great. Thank you. And then with the illustrative reports, we have used the examples in the ER guidance, as we did feel that this was probably more appropriately reflecting the board's latest thinking. And of course, the structure and layout is aligned with part 9 of the standard, which we already discussed in March. We did again take recent comments of the board into account. So rather than just develop a separate reasonable assurance report or a separate limited assurance report, we also prepared a hybrid, which is agreeing with the board comments, of course, that this may in fact be the case in practice, or they are actually occurring in practice. So we have now the 3. There are, of course, many other scenarios that we could consider, but this is an overarching standard, and we generally felt that going further is really straying into the non-authoritative zone or bucket. So this we felt was true even of modified reports. So in addition, we haven't, of course, yet tested part 9 with our stakeholders. So going down a track of creating many reports probably isn't appropriate at this stage. So the issues paper does, of course, recognise that it may be possible for us to develop some other examples in the future as part of non-authoritative guidance and look at all those different scenarios that might crop up. So that's it. That's really all I wanted to cover. So with that background, Tom, sorry, catch you with your back to me. With that background, we can probably turn to the first question. And in the interest of time, Tom, we'd like to just take comments on 1A as a whole rather than go through paragraph by paragraph. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to go through 1A as a whole. I'm just trying to see if we want to break it up. Let's start as a whole, but please be clear with sort of where you're, what paragraphs you're targeting. I know people tend to want to make a general comment as well, too. So we'll ask for raised hands here, and I'll start calling on people. Sachka.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Josephine, and your team on your hard work. I have 3 comments with regard to introduction section, and my first comment is about around paragraph 3 and relating application material about the guidance about at least as demanding, and I really appreciate that the meaning of at least as demanding is now explained upfront in the introduction section, and I really support the level of detail explained. But to be more practical, I think it will be further clarified by each jurisdiction. And I would therefore suggest adding a sentence in the introduction application material to say something like that each jurisdiction may determine what constitute the equivalence to IAASB code, including independence requirements and or ISQMs in the context of at least as demanding. I think this guidance will help to ensure certain consistency in application within the jurisdiction when particularly the assurance becomes mandatory. My second comment is about paragraphs 3 and 4 with regard to profession agnostic. And paragraph 4, the second sentence says, if a practitioner chooses to represent compliance with this or other ISAs, and I think this part should be deleted because it may suggest compliance with ISA 5000 is completely optional and seems to dilute the value of ISA 5000. At the same time, I think it is very important to emphasize that ISA 5000 is a profession agnostic standard. Therefore, my suggestion is that in the leading of paragraph 3, we can add reference to practitioners who are not accountants. I think we can say this ISA is applied by practitioners, including professional accountants, as well as other professionals, and premised on the basis that, and then A and B follow. And my last comment is about general comment around the future of IAC 3410. And I support the description explained the draft about relationship of ISA 5000 and IAC 3410. But in certain cases, I think ISA 5000 and IAC 3410 now take different approach. For example, assessment of risk with regard to limited assurance. Therefore, I think we need to discuss in the near future how we should treat IAC 3410 in a more holistic approach. For example, whether we need to include 3410 as one of the standards into ISA series. I know it is something we need to discuss at the later stage in conjunction with our future work plan, but I just would like to raise right now because we may receive a similar question we expose ISA 5000. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Sachiko. Those comments resonate with me, probably not partly because we were together in Japan last week and we talked about this quite a bit. In fact, I almost think like those areas I'd really like to hear. A lot of people have talked to me about as Lisa's demanding and the profession agnostic standards, and I personally have sympathy with it, but I'd like to get comments on the topics that you raised. So, you know, I'll let people speak, but if you could also if you have a viewpoint on those topics, I'd like to get your point of view as well. So next is Kaiue.
Thanks, Tom, and hello, everyone. Good to see you. I agree with the approach of the task force to introduction, but I have one comment on the keynote to paragraph 5. I'm not really convinced that reporting requirements alone will be enough in the environment for sustainability information. In particular, I think you are going to need to distinguish and explain the difference between criteria designed to meet the information needs to specify, to distinguish and explain the difference between criteria designed to meet the information needs to specify users' special purpose criteria, and those designed to meet the information needs of a wide range of users. That means general purpose criteria. I also believe we will need to add application material to part 3 and maybe to part 6 regarding the suitability of the criteria for the special purpose. We will also need to address, like we do it in ISA 800, when changes to general purpose criteria lead to these criteria becoming special purpose. That's all from my side, Tom. Back to you. Thanks.
Thank you. Ada.
Yes, thank you, Tom, and good to see everybody again. Let me first start with thanking the task force and the staff for bringing this to us in a concise form, because it actually allows you to think about a couple of things and visualize how the requirements of the standard are going to work out, and that triggers a couple of questions. So again, my compliments in that respect. Maybe also touching upon what Sachiko said in respect of the ISQM1 and IAASB code requirements, and at least as demanding. And I agree with the requirements as it's, or with the text as it's currently written. I am, but this is probably more something of something that we need to manage in our outreach. For example, with the SEC and the EC, is that this is not perceived to be anti-competitive. It is not. We just want to have a level playing field of quality as to these engagements. And the reason I was thinking about these is I'm not sure that there is at the moment any other framework that is at least as demanding. Welcome the suggestion of Sachiko, but and maybe Japan is ahead of us and does have requirements that are at least as demanding, but I'm not sure I have been able to identify them. Another comment, and this sits more in respect of of paragraph, what is it, 5, where we and clearly we need to speak about this, and this is in the context, I guess, also of future-proofing our standards, where we speak of framework criteria, maybe either fair presentation criteria or compliance criteria. Well, and fair presentation criteria, I think, and maybe I'm pessimistic, but I think we're quite a long way away from fair presentation criteria for sustainability information. CSRD is not compliance. The IAASB standards, whilst they may have this purpose, with only a standard on greenhouse gases, can hardly be regarded a fair presentation criteria. And I also think it's confusing for non-practitioners what fair presentation means. So I think in respect of a lot of the qualitative disclosures to satisfy the criteria by the frameworks, you will need to assess whether that disclosure fairly reflects what the entity actually has done or is doing, rather than fairly presents. So I'm just triggering this out or teasing this out because I think this may be a complexity, particularly towards the non-accountants practitioners. Those were my comments. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. On that, the point though, as Lisa's demanded, the truth is, I don't think any of us have done a full assessment of the landscape yet. And, we don't tell on the audit side how members of IFER should apply our standards too. And that's sort of why I find what Sachiko has said is quite elegant. And particularly in the way of not highlighting the profession agnostic element of this standard. It sort of reminds people that general design concept that we have in mind. So that's just something I'm very sensitive to as we develop this standard. Diane?
Thanks, Tom. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Josephine, task force, everybody. Again, good set of papers, easy to get through. I'll pick up on something Ado raised because I had a similar comment on paragraph 5, which dealt with the fair presentation and compliance. I struggled a bit as to whether we were ready for that, quite frankly. At this point, I'm not sure we are ready for it. So I would just ask the task force to think about, is it adding a little too much complexity at this point in time? Paragraph 2, an oldie but a goodie, our infamous discussion over sustainability information. I question whether we still have answered the question and clarified sustainability information in the report and sustainability information subject to audit or attestation. So I suspect maybe what you're going to do is when we get into the bowels of the standard, it'll talk about sustainability information subject to the engagement. But I just think that right here, we're still, in my mind, not cracking that code and clarifying that there's big sustainability information, and then your attestation engagement could be on a subset of that. In paragraph 810, this is a nuanced comment. We talk about, when you might have to restrict the distribution. I was questioning whether the word should be restricting the use. And again, this gets into this, what's the intention? Who's the audience? How is the report going to be used? So again, just challenge whether in lieu of distribution, which even in today's environment with electronic reports, I'm not sure you can ever control the distribution of a report, but really challenge whether you want to be clear in the opinion that this is for a specific restricted use for the audience that it was intended. And then finally, in paragraphs 11 and 12, I did question, this is interesting, 3410, 3,000, and how they interplay again with 5,000. I think the question is, could we have situations where 3410 and 3,000 almost trump 5,000 and really become the leading standards that you should stay with on the greenhouse gas? And then just clarifying what's the order of requirements. Do you stay at 3410, 3,000, and 5,000 falls to the bottom with greenhouse gas? Just maybe, and this could just be a Diane issue, but just clarifying if it's clear to the users the right sequencing. And that was it for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Sue?
Thank you. And Diane, I'm going to say it's not a Diane issue, so I'll come back to that in a second. But thank you, Josephine and the team for all the work here. As others said, it's very clear. I have some probably some suggestions around language actually, because it flows into this piece about being used by non-accountants as well. I think in principle there's a lot of things that I very much support. The piece in paragraph 3A and 3B, I'm comfortable with the principle of what we're saying there about the at least as demanding. From a language perspective, in the requirements we talk about the practitioner complying with or applying certain requirements, whereas in the introduction we're talking about being subject to the requirements, and I think that potentially excludes voluntary application of the requirements. So I think maybe some some streamlining there. Paragraph 8 I thought was very, very useful around the not applying to direct engagement, but there was some subsequent paragraphs that used language that was maybe a little bit more loose, and I can send some suggestions, or I can highlight those where I think we could tighten up a little. On consultancy and the mixed engagements, so on paragraph 9 and 10, there was a comment on paragraph 10 which I thought was really helpful, around where you got part of a larger engagement, and I think that's very much a real life issue, certainly at the moment. And I wondered whether the material in that comment would be useful as application material to help bring paragraph 10 to life a bit. A couple more similar comments on 3410, so I won't dwell on those, other than just to say that, building on what Diane was saying, the practitioner feedback was asking questions about what would be considered relatively minor. So I think it's the same thing as to where in that order and that structuring you would fall. Paragraph 13 makes the assumption that the financial statements are audited, which may or may not be the case. So I can again suggest some wording there. And paragraph 14, probably to use Diane's wording, is as an oldie but goodie. This is something we've been struggling with about where sustainability information is other information to financial statements and vice versa. From the practitioner perspective, there were a number of questions about how that might work in practice, and I appreciate that that's probably not the issue for the introduction because we talked about it in detail later on, but as we summarize it, it probably just brings it more to the fore. And obviously, Josephine, I'll send some comments through later. Thank you.
Josephine, I believe you would like to come back in.
Yeah, I just thought I'd pick up a couple of points because I suspect other board members may have similar comments, if that's okay, Tom. So on the are you in 3410 or are you in 5000? What we did with that is that we took what we have that already exists in 3410 and actually really just turned it upside down. So we're just to so the board understands where we got the information from. So we're using the similar language, as I say, we've turned it upside down, and we've tried to stay as close to what 3410 says, because 3410 actually points out that it could be part of other sustainability information if it knew we would be in this situation years on. So we can, just for the board's coming, we can have another look at that and see if we can tighten that up a little bit. But it's generally that feeling we don't really want to stray too far away from what we have in 3410, because then questions start being asked about 3410 and the use of that standard. So there was just that point. And then the other point that came up as well, I just wanted to check in, is in respect to the application material that we have on special purpose framework. And obviously we in the auditing standards, we have two standards that actually deal with this very well, and have a lot of material in this. And what I did want to just get a feel from the board is this is an overarching standard, and that's a very specific area, and it's can be quite a complex area. And we were just dealing with a general purpose standard. We're trying to make it overarching. We generally got direction that the board wanted an acknowledgement that these particular frameworks exist, which we've tried to do without then bringing in a whole lot more volume and complications and requirements. So, for example, there was a comment that we need some information on how you assess criteria in that situation. I mean, that would be quite a big task. I think, if anything, personally, from my personal perspective, I think that's something for the next phase or the next step. And at this stage, I think certainly acknowledging it, we could put a little bit more in the application material to explain it out. I'm sure there is room to do that. But beyond that, I think we're just going too far. So it'd be useful to get other points of view on that, because it is, as I say, quite a complex area. And we were really focused on general purpose at this stage. And the only other point I wanted to make was on fair presentation. We do, as far as I'm aware, S1 is a fair presentation framework, ADO. So I think maybe what we might want to think about is that sort of sits in, for non-practitioners, that sort of sits in non-authoritative guidance, because we have quite a lot in the standard already about what a fair presentation requires the entity to do. And so we'll have a look at what we have, but I think anything beyond what we have now might be more of a non-authoritative guidance piece. And certainly, to your point about outreach, something we can talk about there as well. So I just wanted to pick up on those 3 points because I thought, Tom, they might come up through other board member comments.
Thank you, Josephine. Anyone want to come back specifically on those points, or could we just continue with the hands that are up? Okay, let's, Choe.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Josephine and team. So I do want to come back on one of the points, and that is paragraph 12. And thanks, Josephine, for the explanation. I did realize that it came from 3410 and it's a switch around. But just reading what we have in the introduction, I did have similar question. I think in the past, when 3410 was there, it was 3410 and 3000. So I think that paragraph existed in that context and in that environment. Now with 5,000 being developed, with this overarching standard and with the whole series potentially coming up, I think the question that were raised by other board members about the future of 3410, I think does warrant examining, and maybe we should, in our explanatory memorandum to the ED, provide a little bit of what we're thinking of today. But just going back to this paragraph 12 more specifically, and looking at it just in terms of the wording, I had a question about, because we talk about, first of all, when GHG statement is a primary sustainability information, and then in B, it talks about where it's a relatively minor part. And when I'm just looking at it without referring to 3410, I did have a question about how about the in-between? Because here we have a primary versus minor. How about if it's for 50%, 60%? So that there's also a little bit of question mark there as well, which I thought it looks like a little gap which has not been addressed in this particular introduction. So I think that leads to the wider question. So that's on paragraph 12. The other point I wanted to raise is actually up front, is on paragraph 2. And it's more specific wordings here. So we talk about sustainability information relates to ESG, including such and such, that may be relevant. And I guess I have a little question mark around the maybe. Why maybe? If it's not relevant, then it wouldn't be considered at all, would it? So I'm not sure about the word maybe. And then the last bit where we say law or reg or framework may also refer to specific factors relating to these or other matters. I find this statement quite vague, even when I read it in conjunction with the application material. So I wonder if what we want to say here, can it be said in more plain language? For example, do we mean, the law and reg and framework may require specific sustainability information to be considered or disclosed? Is this what we mean? And if so, is it possible to make it plainer? And I have a couple of others editorial suggestions which I'll send through. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Wendy?
Thank you, Tom. And thank you to Josephine and the task force. The papers were well put together and easy to get through. Not surprisingly, I have a lot of the same comments that were already discussed. And so I'm going to go in order. I will also send in some edits and commentary on words similar to what Sue said, because words sometimes do matter. Talking about 2, I'll be honest, when I read 2 in the introduction, I was more confused than I was when I had talked about in the previous meeting about the definition of sustainability information. So I think, you know, throughout, from introduction throughout the whole standard, that still needs some work for understandability, but would make a suggestion that we pull in from A2 for purposes of this ISA, the first sentence, pull that into number 2. So it is abundantly clear that it is in the entirety of the sustainability information. And then I think the definition and the rest of it will flow through the standard. And then I was wondering in A2 whether there should be a reference to the definition, not only to part 3. So that would be a reference to part 2. And I'm just going to go in order of the paragraphs, going to the first comment that Sachiko made about IAASB and the ISQM1 standards. I, like Edo, was content with the language that was there, but I was wondering if there were other things that could be done in the environment. I was also concerned about barriers to entry. I think that the gap for me is bridging what are the key concepts in the IAASB code with what might be in other codes. And I don't know that we have the data on what might be in other codes, and that does need to be collected. I also thought it might benefit if we thought about some educational materials and did some education on the key aspects of, for example, what's in A4 to members of the ecosystem, or particularly the non-practitioners, because perhaps there's too much of an expectation that there are other codes out there that are at least as demanding. So those are some additional thoughts on paragraph 3. Let's keep scrolling through here. Paragraph 5, similar comments about the framework and whether or not paragraph 5 just gets into way too much detail, but then also the concept of whether or not we are ready for something such as a fair presentation framework in this overarching standard. So that's similar to the comment that Ado raised. Same concerns about the connectivity of 3410 to the overarching standard, particularly the judgment that the engagement teams would have to use. And then I also would throw in there at some point, maybe it's in the EM, what's going to happen with the EER guidance, which is near and dear to my heart because I think it was the first thing I voted on when I joined the board. So we've started to move away from it in some of the, later when we talk about the reporting. So how are we going to manage what may still be appropriate from a non-authoritative guidance perspective, and what has been superseded? So something to consider, and I think that covers most of my comments. And again, I just want to add on to the sustainability information. I'm still not sure I'm completely clear. I was completely clear on the other information when I left the last meeting. It is everything other than what we are assuring, but the words are not flowing through from the introduction through what I saw as the standard from the last meeting, which I know is being updated. Thank you.
Thank you, Josephine.
Thank you. I just want to pick up though on this point on Wendy's point. I don't know what we do with their presentation. So I'm not quite sure. I'll need to get some advice from the board here about what's expected, because yes, we know there are fair presentation frameworks out there. We have included quite a lot of material on what that means in the application material to the standard and in the standard itself. We also have a couple of requirements from memory in there which help you get to that point. So I really need to understand what more is expected in a standard, or are we really looking for just being conscious of it in when we're seeking outreach, when we're doing our outreach and seeking information from our stakeholders, whether it's something that we need to think about for non-authoritative guidance, because I think we've really gone as far as we can. And I'm obviously happy, of course, for any of the task force members and staff to jump in on this as well. But this is literally just picking up information that's in the standard that we've already talked about. So it's not new. We're not introducing anything new here. We've already discussed this in December and in March. So I'm just concerned we're raising something that we've already been through as a board. Tom?
So, Josephine, I can respond back with two things. One, in your top 10, it did say something about clarifying the definitions of fair presentation and a compliance framework. And I wasn't really sure. I honestly, I didn't remember the conversation, so I wasn't really sure how that was going to pull through. And so really there were 2 points. I thought paragraph 5 was too long. If it's going to, as you just said, it's already in the standard. So maybe it could stop after the first sentence or the second sentence. I didn't think we needed that much in the introduction. And then the different comment was whether or not, we were at the maturity level to be able to use the concept of fair presentation, and whether or not that was something that non-practitioners would understand. So I hear what you said about there is a lot of guidance. And when I read it all together, that would probably be helpful. So hopefully that was responsive to some of your thoughts.
And Wendy and Ado and others who raised it, the fact that just because IAASB is a fair presentation framework, we're framework agnostic here. And is that somewhat of your concern about, unintentionally being pinned to as if we were drafting standards just for IAASB, even though that will be a preeminent standard that is used for sustainability information. Ado, I saw your hand came up instantly when I started to talk. So.
Yes, thank you, Tom. And maybe just to clarify, because I know that IAASB delineates itself as fair presentation. Notwithstanding whether or not that's at this point in time fair or not, that's not up to me. But maybe if we can clarify that because at the moment a lot of these engagements deal with subsets of information, and can a subset of information, when not the entirety of this fair presentation framework is covered, be considered fair presentation? I think just the understanding for particularly non-practitioners what that means in practice would be helpful.
Yeah, maybe the best thing to say is there's been a lot of comment on this point, and that the task force needs to consider the issue a little bit with the context of the discussions. That I think Wendy provided some suggestions, others people have provided some suggestions, and note that it's just a point. It remains on our top 10 list of topics to address. Josephine, anything more to say on the fair presentation issue?
I think that also there's sort of maybe, if I understand Wendy, it's also looking at the whole package. To Wendy's point, when you see the whole package together, what we have in the introduction, what we have in there, is there sufficient in there for somebody who's not come across a fair presentation framework, irrespective of which framework that might be? Can they really understand what that means, and do we have sufficient guidance in our standard to guide them through that? And I do think there may be still a need for something additional somewhere down the track, which is educational material. Yes, certainly we'll have a look at it, and we'll be in a good position because we'll have it all together and see if we've got all the pieces in the right spot. So yeah, thank you.
Diane, you re-raised your hand. Was it on this point?
Yeah, it was. And I think, Josephine, that's the right. What I was struggling with is, why does it matter? Right? Why does this matter? And acknowledging that you could have a compliance framework or a fair presentation framework? The question is, why does it matter? And I think maybe reflecting back through the standard, because where it may matter is Ado's example, is it's a fair presentation standard, but for some reason the company has gone through and picked out pieces, which we then get into our whole circle again of suitability and rationale and all that good jazz. But the question is, does it matter? At the end of the day, if an organization has chosen to only take a subset, is it still fair presentation? Or is there something that now the auditor has a responsibility to report? So maybe just think about through from beginning all the way through to reporting, why does it matter? And maybe that might help us make sure that we've got all the pieces covered. That would be my only suggestion. Thank you.
Okay, I think we've addressed that issue as much as we can right now. Of course, we take other helpful suggestions, but this is something, as we would say, needs to be noodled on, Diane, right? Eric.
Thanks, Tom, and I want to thank the task force and staff for all the work and the introduction. I thought it was very complete in terms of covering the topics that I thought were important to include in the introduction. And many of my comments have already been raised, so I will not dwell on them, but I just need to highlight them nevertheless. I think on paragraph 2, in the discussions we had, just struggling a bit about whether this was a complete description of sustainability information. Like Chun-Wee struggled a bit with the maybe relevant piece, and also wondered whether it was missing what is dealt with in some of the frameworks around proper preservation, development, and regenerating the needs of the present without compromising the future. Those concepts are in a number of frameworks and don't seem to be fully reflected in our discussion here. The next paragraph, while I'm supportive of the discussion about what is at least as demanding, I did struggle in paragraph A5, where it says that the requirements need to address all the matters referred to in the IAASB code and achieve the aims of the requirements set out in the code. That seemed to me a very onerous intention, and I think it's going to be a struggle for people to really know what that means. So wondered if that needs to be thought in a bit more depth as to, you know, what really the essence of that is. It seems like it's got to be the code. So moving along, I had similar thoughts around paragraph 11 and 12 and 13, all around the interaction of this standard and 3000, 3410 and the audit standards. So I won't repeat those, but I think I agree particularly with Chun-Wee's comment about, I think it'd be useful in the EM to explain what we think was the future direction with respect to 3410, or at least what we're hoping will be the outcome of that. On paragraph 13, I guess my question about this paragraph was really the sort of the so what comment is sort of, yes, there may be information, sustainability information included in the entity's financial statements, and that information will have been audited. So what's the implications for this standard? What does that mean? We've sort of tried to address that question in 30, from a 3410 point of view and a 3000 point of view, but what are we actually saying here? There's a reference to a paragraph base 17, but I'm not sure if that was just to be developed or whether it's going to address that question. And I'll just see if there's other ones. I have some other comments that we will send offline, but those were the significant ones I wanted to mention right now. But again, I just wanted to say thank you to the task force for at least having a very complete go at this. I thought it was very helpful.
Thank you. Julie?
Thanks, Tom, and thanks, Josephine, and your task force for bringing this to the board today. I don't think you're going to hear a lot of new comments from me, but I'll go through the ones I had. Some of them have already been raised. On paragraph 2 and A2, some of the other board members have mentioned this potential inconsistency between the definition that we have of sustainability information and what we've written in paragraph 2. I believe Wendy or others have provided a potential solution there. I think just making it clear we're not talking about two different things, because at the moment it feels like the definition and paragraph 2 are somewhat different. One is talking about what I think is a broader set of information, and A2 really talks about what the assurance engagement is relative to. So anyway, I'll leave that point with the task force because others have raised it as well. On paragraph 5, I will not belabor the point, Josephine, about fair presentation or compliance, but what maybe one question I had that didn't come up was, it left me a little bit hanging on entity developed criteria. It doesn't say if entity developed criteria could be fair presentation or compliance. I'm guessing the task force had thought that was really going to be a non-issue and therefore not mentioned, but in your discussions around this whole topic, maybe just consider that as an additional question and whether that sort of leaves you hanging at the end of that sentence. On paragraph, I'll say 11 and 12, same questions about the interaction with 3410. To the extent we can provide a visual or something that says if this circumstance applies, these are the standards that are applicable, would probably be helpful. For instance, in my outreach, the question came up of if a small amount of other sustainability information is included in the GAG statement. It says what we have in the introduction says that ISO 3410 applies, but it's unclear what standards the non-GHG information should be subject to. So if you kind of think of different scenarios and then say, here's how it would work, you don't have to have a ton of them, but the more common ones might be helpful to explain for people. I hate to say it, but the other point around the interaction with 3000, 3410 for me is probably that mapping that you referred to back in our March meeting. And that I think that will help make it more clear as to what's been brought across and what's not been brought across to 5000. So we understand how those all work together. And one of my favorite / thorns in my side, the other information point, I just had a question in 14 if we'd scoped in too much there as other information. We refer to items that are obviously other information, but then we say something along the lines that financial statements that are separate from the sustainability information would be considered other information, and I was questioning that one there, because if they're truly separate and don't accompany, the sustainability information, have we blurred the lines there on other information? And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Kai?
Thank you, and congratulations to Josephine and the task force for the great work that's been done. I think this is a very good introduction and gives a good start for this discussion. Most of the things that the comments I had have also been covered. I did have similar concerns or questions around the interaction with 3410, as Julie and others have raised. Around at least as demanding, that's one that's been high on the list from everyone that I've been talking to. I have sympathy for, or I like what the task force have done here, but I also have sympathy for the additions or changes that were suggested by Sachiko. I think they may be good in this respect. So I think that was it for me now. Thanks.
Thanks. Finding my unmute button. Greg.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks, Josephine, and everyone for the work. It's 5 to midnight, I think, here, so bear with me. I just want to cover 3 points, and I think 2 of the 3 are already on the table here, Tom. But the first one is paras 3 and 4, and at least as demanding the code and quality management. I think we have to land where we're landing here, but I don't think it'll be seen as profession agnostic. But I think I've been agonizing and trying to think about, well, how else could we do it? Because we have to set a minimum standard one way or another. And I think whatever we do for ethics and the code, we have to do the same on quality management. And I think we are almost consistent at the moment. And I just want to check where someone pointed out the word all in A5. So I think it was Eric addressed all of the requirements of the code. But in the quality management one on A8, we just say address the requirements. We don't say all. So I don't know if that's deliberate or not, but I would have thought if we're setting a minimum standard, we probably have to say all for both. But that could be deliberate drafting the way it currently is. So just put it there. But just on the main point, as I say, I think this won't be seen as profession agnostic. It'll be seen as you must comply with the code in ISQM1. But it's hard to go anywhere else, I think, as a board here, because we have to set a standard. We have to describe what the bar is, and I'm not sure how else we could do it. So I think the position we've landed on is right, but let's just check the consistency between those 2 pillars of ethics and quality. My second point's about paragraph 7. And there is just the last sentence in paragraph 7. I'm just not sure why we need to do that signposting. So the sentence I'm talking about here is paragraph 12 describes the applicability of this ISA when the sustainability information includes greenhouse gas statement. So we're signposting forward to another paragraph in the intro. But I'm not, I don't see that sort of signposting elsewhere in here. I'm not sure why we need that sentence. So just a question mark about that. And then my last point's just about A10, and various people have talked about this, a special purpose framework. And it's the first half of A10 really, that I just wonder how close we are to the language that is already really in the financial side of ISA world. already. You know, specific users and meeting their information needs is the basic concept already. We've already got that. And in this case, we're using words like certain intended users, and we're talking about purpose rather than meeting their needs. So Sylvia and I have got some suggested wording that we're happy to send through, but and it just gets us more back to what is already the sort of language that is used in our own special purpose framework. So, for example, it would start off, in some cases, specific users impose a requirement rather than certain intended users. So it's just a couple of sentences, happy to send that through to staff if it's of any use. But there's great work here. This is a really good intro. I think covers the field. So just a few thoughts there, Tom. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. I think your comments sort of set up the antenna for me, because I don't want our standards to be seen as not practitioner agnostic. Let's put it that way. So it's clearly not the intent that thou shalt code, because we acknowledge the fact that there could be other equivalent code. So this really goes back to sort of Sachiko's introduction and my sensitivity on this. I think with a combination of some language from Sachiko and maybe what we need to do over time is have some bridging language in educational material or elsewhere that sort of relates what are IAASB concepts to potentially other frameworks. We could give a sense that IAASB uses this language, but there may be other acceptable frameworks that have similar concepts as well. And we haven't really done a comprehensive exercise of assessing that. I think IAASB is doing some work in that regard, and we may be able to draw upon some of that. And maybe it's some joint materials developed over time. I think we've been so fixated on getting something out to the marketplace, but I don't want to give the impression that there's only one way to comply with this, or otherwise we're going to undermine our commitment to a profession agnostic standard, and will undermine efforts to achieve a global consensus around ISSA 5000, where securities regulators and others have called for a profession agnostic standard. So I just not necessarily disagreed with you, but the fact that you read it that way emphasizes why we need to pay particular attention to those paragraphs. Particularly, I think A5 is an example. Josephine, I wonder if you got a lot there. There was one other thing I raised offline, but probably should say, is that attestation, the concept comes up for the first time, and there's something probably we can do in definitions that resembles what we have in ISA 3000. This is a word that may not resonate outside the accountancy community. So definitionally, we could probably address it. And then the other thing is we use the word consultancy rather than advisory. We use both, and then we focus on consultancy. I think that may cause confusion. Advisory may be a more relevant term, because effectively consultants are doing the assurance work in many instances. So that's just a language sensitivity if we're being profession agnostic. Josephine, back to you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I won't obviously go through every single point here. We did have some really good suggestions on editorials from all board members, so thank you for that. And I've got all of those, and hopefully Task also pick those up as well. So kind of the key points then are at least as demanding. think that generally Sachiko's wording, thank you Sachiko so much for that. It was great timing, seemed to have been accepted by most as being really helpful in bridging that gap between, what do we mean as what more can we say about at least as demanded, but let's also recognize it would be others to make that decision in a lot of cases. But also just briefly on A5, Eric, this is a funny one because of course we've just lifted that from 3,000, but the good news is even the task force kind of scratched their head on that one. So we're going to have a chat about that anyway at the task force meeting next week. So hopefully we'll be able to make that a bit clearer. On fair presentations, some good helpful advice there. It's understanding what does that mean in practice and why does it matter? So that's really helpful, Diane, as always. Just, why does it matter? What's it important to? And then also with that in our minds, do we have enough material in there? In terms of, there was comments about entity developed criteria could be potentially fair presentation. Not really come across that before. Generally, what you tend to find is entity developed criteria in a fair presentation framework is used to get you to that point where the framework itself isn't giving you enough to get to that fair presentation point. So I've never really thought of it as being something that you could do as an entity yourself to get to that point, but we'll go away and I'll let the much smarter people noodle over that with me for a little bit, see what we can do there. Thank you. A couple of things that we need to address in the future. We do need to keep, so it's almost like our not quite hints and tips, but on our later to-do list, we need to think about whether we need to do anything else with the EER guidance. I mean, obviously it's still there, it's still being used, and have we done, if we're making improvements and changes to our standard, do we need to actually reflect that in the non-authoritative guidance as well? And also in the future, there was a point Sachiko made at the very beginning that others also raised is, well, where will 3410 sit? And, something also to noodle on in the future. And does it really belong to the 5,000 series actually going forward? So that's something to think about. A couple of comments on sustainability information description. Clearly we are trying to make sure we're aligned with our sister board with this description, but the one thing that did come through, which is important, is not to confuse what we have as a definition with the description and make sure that's clear. And there was some peculiar language we raised in there, which was quite amusing in terms of the use of may. And then the other points are interactions with 3410. Again, we need a little bit more help and guidance on that. It was a suggestion maybe we could think up some different scenarios. Actually it's something really maybe the task force should consider when they're looking at what guidance we need as well. Do we have enough there to steer people? Admittedly though, we have to all recognize at the end of the day it is down to professional judgment. And if you are, I don't think we could ever say what does in between really mean. And then you have to decide, well, maybe I need to apply both. And maybe I need to report on the both. And there is that element of professional judgment that's needed here. But we will try and put as much guidance as we can to help people in that situation. And making sure that paragraph 14 on other information, make sure that's actually consistent with what we have in part 8. Because when it was read back to me, I think that's where there may be a little bit of an issue. And then at some point, maybe another one for the future, which was the point that Tom made, future to address, is that, maybe at some point down the line, we need some bridging language and educational material, and what we mean by, at least as demanding. So, yeah, I think those were the key points. Again, thank you for your editorials. Please send those along when you can. That would be great. Thank you. So
thank you, Josephine. I think we sort of, through part 1 of your assessment, and we have the illustrative materials coming up next.
Yeah.
Would it be a good opportunity would people appreciate a 10-minute break to refresh coffees if you're early in the morning? If you're late in the evening, Greg, you could have something else to drink. We'll let you fill in the blank. But let's reconvene at 20 minutes after the hour. Okay, so that's 12 minutes. Okay, we're going to start in about a minute. I think we're be ready to get up to all the 1Bs. Okay, Josephine, do you want to say anything about the illustrative reports before we begin?
No, I already sort of gave the introduction for those. Thanks, Tom. The only thing is I've got the lovely Adriana here and Claire who put all the work into this. So thank you both. And we do need to make sure a couple of points that we do cover paragraphs 12B to 13C. And the other thing I just wanted to ask the board is that given we are meeting next week, and I know it's a big task, if you can at all possible, send us your written comments before, certainly before Monday next week, that would be really fantastic. We have received some already, so really appreciate that. But I want to say that now in case I forgot, and then I was sending out emails. So yeah, so Tom, we can immediately go to board's comments, and we'll probably go through them in order though. So let's start with B1, if that's okay. Thank you.
Okay, 1-B.1.
Yeah.
Comments on 1-B.1. The unmodified reasonable assurance report. Okay, Josephine, you guys are done. Oh, sorry. Sajiko is the brave first soul.
I'm not sure I'm brave, but anyway, I will start. I have several comments on illustration 1, and the first comment is about a general comment. It's about illustration of modified opinion and conclusion. I think we need to provide illustration with modified opinion and conclusion for both reasonable and limited, at least in the final standard or educational material, because it's a professional agnostic, and we cannot assume that practitioners will be able to prepare modified assurance report in a similar way based on the experience with audit. That's my first comment. And my next comment is on other information section in illustration 1. And the first sentence says, management is responsible for the other information. And from the definition of other information, I would assume it will include auditor's report on the financial statement, because in this illustration, the sustainability information and the practitioner's report thereon have been included in the company's annual report. So if so, the first sentence I think it should be changed, because management is not responsible for the auditor's report. My next comment is on inherent limitation section. I have two thoughts. And first, the illustrated differences between inherent limitation and emphasis on matter are not very clear. I understand that inherent limitations are presented in a measurement or evaluation of the underlying subject matter, irrespective of whether they have been disclosed by the preparers, and therefore emphasis on matter is more entity specific and inherent limitation is relatively generic. But I received feedbacks that the differentiation is not reflected well in the illustration. And second, illustration refers to the climate-related scenarios that is subject to inherent uncertainty. But I feel that reference is too prescriptive and will end up with numerous other types of inherent limitation, especially when the engagement covers the entire sustainability information. Therefore, my suggestion is changing it to more generic description, which also help distinguishing inherent limitation from emphasis on matter. My next comment is on practitioners' responsibilities. And the last paragraph refers to practitioners experts such as engineers and environmental scientists. But I think the draft ISA 5000 does not mandate description of practitioners expert, and the use of such expert is not always required by the engagement. Therefore, I think to avoid misunderstanding, I think additional explanation related to the use of practitioners expert should be included in the assumed circumstances in the first page. And my last point is on summary of the work performed section. For reasonable assurance engagement, I do not see much merit in describing the nature, timing, and extent of the procedure performed, in addition to general descriptions already included in practitioner's responsibility section. So I think we can eliminate summary of the work performed from reasonable assurance report. That's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Wendy?
Thanks, Tom. I think I'll say first that it's hard to read the illustrations separate from part 9 and the rest of the standards, so I may have additional comments at a later point. I have some similar comments to Sachiko and probably a lot of editorials that we will send in, and some of the themes that we already discussed earlier. I have similar comments on pulling through into the report. For example, the fair presentation framework. Do we really need to say that in an illustration, because there could be other than a fair presentation framework? You know, and some of the language that we talked about in the introduction related to the entirety of the sustainability information, some of that clarity needs to pull through the illustration. And I think one of the key points that Sachiko touched on is in the illustration is for an engagement that was conducted by a multidisciplinary team. I think more is needed to explain what a multidisciplinary team is, but I wasn't really thinking that we would be referring explicitly to experts. We don't do that from an audit perspective, not that this, you know, as it relates to experts. So I wasn't really clear why we were bringing that into the auditor's report, but maybe, you know, when I see the full standard, or maybe there's a definition that needs to be added for multidisciplinary, but I was not thinking that we really needed that. And then a broad comment on all of the reports is I was concerned about the level of detail for the work being performed, whether it's a limited assurance engagement or a reasonable assurance engagement. And I was concerned about setting thresholds in illustrations that might then become what people do. Particularly for limited, because there's quite a range of what people do to support limited assurance. And so I think I will stop there and perhaps have some more as we go through the illustrations that relate to all of them. Thank you.
Thank you. Chun-Li?
Thanks, Tom. So first point echoes Sachiko's first point about modified report, so I won't elaborate. Second point is on the practitioner's responsibility, the last paragraph as well, but slightly different point. I actually like that. I think it provides transparency over the work that has been conducted. So inclusion in the illustrations of signal that this is encouraged. The spirit of this paragraph, though, is quite different from the requirement in paragraph 5. So paragraph 5, together with the related application materials, are not about diluting practitioners' responsibility as a result of involvement of expert. So the illustration here and paragraph 5 sort of doesn't quite gel. I'm quite keen to keep this in the illustration, maybe slightly different from other colleagues. And I wonder if we want to add something to the application material, maybe to signal that such transparency in the use of expert may be welcomed by users of the reports. My last point is the second paragraph is on summary of work performed. I think similar to what Sachiko and Wendy have mentioned. And I think maybe it's slightly different from Wendy, because for limited assurance, I think the requirement make it quite clear, because it's limited assurance, it's more important to elaborate on what is done so that there is clear understanding of the extent of work that's performed. And I think in the requirement, we make it quite clear that for reasonable assurance, you don't actually have to say so much. It doesn't add on to the value. So I'm just wondering, I think similar to what Sachiko suggested, whether we need this insert summary of nature and extent, because it seems to be inconsistent with what we have in the requirement application material. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you. Kayo? The dreaded you're on mute.
Thanks Tom, for the advice. I mentioned that I very acknowledge the work as done by Josephine, the task force, and the staff. Thanks very much. Let me mention in general, I'm largely in favor of the approach taken by the task force to the reports, but I have some comments on a number of paragraphs, and I will give my comments on the first report, but they also apply to the other two reports. I would like to start with the paragraph where the heading is basis for opinion. It seems to me that the listing of the fundamental principles belongs after the statement about fulfilling the other ethical responsibilities, because the fundamental principles do not directly relate to the independence requirements. That has been my first comment. Then I will have a comment to the paragraph where the heading is management responsibilities. In most cases, the entity will need to supplement the framework criteria. I believe we should add there here and explain that management has a responsibility to select the additional criteria and determine their suitability. Then my next comment relates to the paragraph where the heading is inherent limitation in preparing the sustainability information. What we really ought to pick up here in the inherent limitation as well are any inherent limitation residing from information from the supply chain outside of the entity or its corporate group. Another item that we currently have in the European Union, for example, is the inherent uncertainty as to whether entity developed criteria to interpret the framework criteria are in conformance with the framework criteria. Then my next comment relates to the paragraph where the heading is practitioner's responsibility. Since the inherent limitations section is between the description of management and the practitioner's responsibilities, it may be useful to add a sentence that clarifies that the inherent limitation affects both the preparation of and the assurance on the sustainability information. Then my next comment belongs to the same paragraph where I have to mention management responsibility should be augmented to cover their responsibility for the appropriateness of the measurement and evaluation methods, etc. Then I think that's my last, not the last one, but at the very end. Then I have a very brief comment to the quality management paragraph. I would move this section under the basis for opinion section. Then a short comment also to the summary of the work performed. I'm not convinced that we need the section on the summary of the work performed for reasonable assurance engagement. You might want to know that IAASB 3410 does not include the section for a reasonable assurance engagement report. And then I think that's my last comment, refer to the paragraph report on legal and on other legal and regulatory requirements. In my view, we need to consider the requirements in paragraph 6 and this section on report on other legal and regulatory requirements, because assurance reports on sustainability information may be included in auditors' reports on financial statements in some jurisdictions, which implies that we would have an insurance report in the section within an assurance report with an auditor's report. I think that's all, Tom. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Kai. Julie?
Thanks, Tom. And Josephine, my comments apply to all of the illustrations, so I will specify when they don't, but just for clarity. And we heard on the modified example, I appreciate that there isn't a modified opinion example in other standards, but I do think that it would be worthwhile exploring that as an example for two reasons. One is, with only providing the unmodified examples in the illustrations, I think it could potentially give the impression that that would be the expected outcome in all cases, would be an unmodified, either a conclusion or a opinion. So I'm concerned about that without providing the alternative. And then secondly, what I've heard from those that practice in this area is that there is probably an expectation that there will be modified reports, at least for a little while, as the maturity of some of these maturity of some of the reporting and the entity level controls and all that goes into preparing the information comes about. So I think it would be worthwhile pursuing at least one example with a modification. The other piece that's sort of overall is that a recommendation that we provide some guidance that would help a practitioner in reporting when they're reporting on maybe a subset or a selection of metrics, because right now our examples are when you're providing assurance over the entire report. And I do think there'll be circumstances, probably many, where there may just be a selection of metrics that are being assured. And could we provide at least some guidance that would direct to practitioner what to do in that circumstance? In the examples at the top of each of the examples, we lay out the report circumstances and wondered if it'd be worthwhile in that section to add some language around the framework being the criteria. So that links back to the defined term, who selected the criteria and how it's made available to the intended users, just to bring more clarity to the report examples. As well, sorry, moving on. Sorry, I'm forgetting who brought up the point around management responsibilities, but could there be something that we could add there that talks about whose responsibility, that it's management's responsibility to select the criteria in the examples? And then I think it's just a drafting point, but in one of the illustrations, there seems to be a requirement in the bracketed words where you get to the report on other legal and regulatory requirements. There's a shall statement in those brackets. I presume it's just a drafting point that we just need to move that. If it's a requirement, we should just move that into the standard and I'll have it in the illustration. Thanks.
Josephine, do you want to come?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, these are all really, really helpful. Thank you so much. And just a couple of things I wanted to raise. The one is on modified opinions. Now, in the worst case scenario, if we were to do a modified opinion, say for the 3 illustrations, that comes out to 16 additional reports. So that's a little bit mad. So that's why we thought ultimately, because modifications are more complex, you've got 4 different scenarios in a modification. We didn't want to go down that track, and we wanted to use the educational non-authoritative route to do that, and that's something we can do in the future. And then we can also build in lots of different scenarios. However, we've got 3 board members now who've said that they really would like to see that. So I think what I'd like a steer on, and nods is fine, is if we if we, rather than have 16, which is really unnecessary, if we pick one, say a limited assurance engagement, and it's just a qualified opinion on misstatement, for example, I don't know, I know we've got a couple in the bag, but something like that, would that be sufficient at least to give some idea of what a modification would look like? Because I think anything else we could end up, as I say, there are 16 different scenarios here, and that's too many. So when perhaps the next board members, when they come in, could just give us some idea on that, and others. And then actually, to Julie's point on the metrics, Julie, I don't want to forget this point, but the hybrid one is supposed to be dealing with different sections. I mean, maybe it's as simple as maybe changing one of that, so the limited assurance engagement piece of it is on just metrics and targets. Would that help? And that way we're dealing with a section and then okay, that's helpful. Thank you. And then one other important point, which is the reasonable assurance. There are three, I think now, certainly Sachko and Chun-Wei did not see any merit, and I think also Kaiwa do not see any merit in talking about the nature, time, extent of procedures in a reasonable assurance engagement. My personal view is I would agree with that, but really want to hear from others, because that would mean taking that out and then we can move on. But so let's do it from a different perspective. If any board members really feel that should absolutely be in there, then do speak up. But other than that, it's things about that was really the three areas I wanted to just raise there, Tom. Thank you.
Okay, so hopefully you'll get some responses to that, Edo. You're on mute.
Indeed, thank you, Tom. Yes, and I will cover that off, Josephine. So in respect of the reasonable assurance report, I was also thinking about, well, what is going to be helpful to the practitioners out there, and then particularly from the non-accountant practitioners. And I think we need to have an illustration that helps them along the path, particularly if they are not as familiar with the IAASB or the 3000 standards. So I was also thinking of modified report, and I guess just maybe a limitation on scope for a limited assurance engagement would help. I think that was one that may particularly come up as this develops. I was also wondering whether we could have an illustration where a non-accountant practitioner, where we illustrate the IAASB code or ISQ M1 at least as demanding in the fact pattern, and to work that out as an example, to also inform our non-accountant practitioners. And I had a question on whether the example needs to be a fair presentation framework, but it's given that the limited assurance one deals with a compliance framework, I'm okay with that. In looking at the geography of the report, I struggled a little bit with the other information. The other information deals with management responsibilities which haven't been talked about yet, that only comes after. It seems that it has more prominence at the moment than it needed. So I was wondering if that could go back. And if I think about inherent limitations, and other colleagues have talked about the inherent limitations as well, those are quite important in the context of this report, and probably closer to the importance of the emphasis of matter. So I would move that up immediately after that section. I was somewhat, and this applies to all of the reports. So there's the requirement in 3C4 to identify the sustainability information. And I wasn't sure that in the report as such, it was particularly clear what all that sustainability information is that we are providing assurance on. It's relatively generically at the moment called sustainability information. So I think there could be another level of precision there. In respect of the summary of work performed, My notes that I drew up here for this is that at the moment there's a large amount of overlap between the practitioner's responsibilities and summary of work performed, or at least there's the potential for significant overlap. And in my view, in respect of a reasonable assurance report, we do not need the summary of work performed as long as the responsibilities are clearly articulated. And I will come back to this in respect of the limited assurance report separately. And then I think there's a comment somewhere in the report, or I don't think so, I know so, that talks about the reasonableness of the scenarios. And this is also when the experts and specialists are being used. Maybe you could have a look at that example, because I don't think there's any framework at the moment that will ask us to evaluate the reasonableness of the scenarios, but more the process or the inputs to those scenarios. So that sort of compromises my comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ada. Sue?
Thanks, Tom. So I was very comfortable with the approach that you got around exposing the 3 examples at this particular stage, although I do support the concept of maybe just one fairly straightforward modified report as well. I did wonder whether there was maybe something about putting together what we might think about the examples that might be included at a later stage as we think about exposure, partly to help manage expectations, because you're right, Josephine, you know, the collection could get enormous. So what would add most value to people? And I think you've had a couple of good examples, and I think that the piece about an example for a non-accountant is a very good one to be thinking about including. In relation to the example report, I wondered whether there was a way, perhaps presentationally, of distinguishing between the things that absolutely have to be there and we think should be there for all reports, versus the things that you've maybe introduced to provide a little bit of flavour and life to the examples. And I'm thinking there, you know, perhaps in this first example, you've got the emphasis of matter. We've had people mentioning the use of the expert. I mean, they bring it to life, but if you think about this as being probably the example that everyone is going to go to first, I think if we could be clear about where the practitioner needs to tailor and apply versus what's expected would be helpful. In terms of other areas, and this applies across the board, in management responsibilities, we'd wondered about highlighting the responsibility for management's responsibility for estimates, because so many sustainability disclosures are driven by estimation. And then in the summary of work piece, I've had a request from some of the practitioners around examples for reasonable assurance. Following the discussion, I'm comfortable with leaving it out, but I think where it really stands out is in example 3 or illustration 3, where we have a long shopping list for the limited assurance, and then we have nothing at all for reasonable. And I think that's kind of where the crunch is. In the context of this illustration, I would be comfortable potentially leaving it out, but I think if we are, you know, as we move on, we maybe want to think about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Diane?
Okay, so to answer your specific questions, I did feel pretty strongly that we needed a modified example, and I'd vote for a scope limitation. I also agree with Julie that I think this issue of a subset of information can be messy, because you've got to have some way to indicate in your report what pieces was subject to your audit, and you need to give some sort of reference or indication. And I know that gets messy, but I do think those 2 additional, I would not build a missile, but if you could at least give a flavor of those 2, I actually think they're pretty prevalent. I agree. My first reaction was I didn't think we needed to describe the nature and extent of procedures for reasonable assurance, although Sue brings up an interesting point. When you put them together, it does look a little unbalanced, but by itself, I did not think you need to go into it. And then consistent with Wendy, this concept of the multidisciplinary team, at the end of the day, I do get a little concerned because the partner in charge is taking responsibility for all the work. I don't think we want to imply to somebody that there may have been division of responsibility, but at the end of the day, or division of work, I should say, but at the end of the day, the responsibility still lies with that partner. And so I would lean towards not getting into the multidisciplinary team concept. And those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Eric?
Thank you, Tom. And many similar comments to others. I'm particularly supportive of the subset of metrics comments that other board members have made, as well as the modified situation. Have similar views around the summary of work for the reasonable assurance. I think that just adds length to the report that I'm not sure gets a lot of value for readers. And just talking to the multidisciplinary team, some of the wording in there, and I think Edo may have mentioned it, about the assisting with determining the reasonableness of the scenarios. It does potentially create some confusion about who's taking overall responsibility for the assurance opinion, if they are articulated as assisting with determining things. I think we could just use basic wording around, performing procedures relating to particular aspect of the work, as opposed to sort of giving the impression they've determined or had a role in determining anything. But those are my comments. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. Kai?
Thank you. 3 comments from my side. That's also goes in line with what you've heard pretty much so far. On reports, I do support having 1 or 2 examples of modifications, just to show an example of that. 1 could be fine. I say your finger, but then because I support your comment, Josephine, that it may be better to do some of this through educational material. It can be done then in a different form and also be a bit more flexible, which I think is helpful. So I agree on that. On the point around precision on what we provide assurance on has been picked up by others. I think that's an important one, and that we may need to go to additional level on some of this. So there may be more to be done there. The last one around multidisciplinary team under practitioner's responsibility. I agree with the points being raised. Also, if you think about it in a different scenario, this may be given in a report together with the financial report and the auditor's opinion on the financials. In that scenario, we may also have multidisciplinary teams that have helped us, and we don't have this same paragraph in there. So could this cause additional confusion? And as Diane said, would it then confuse who's actually, will it dilute the responsibilities? So thank you.
Josephine?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Just wanted to jump in on something that that Sue mentioned, which I thought was actually really helpful. And it might deal with a lot of some of the issues that we're raising in the meeting today, which is that, some concerns around the language we're using, which goes beyond the basic, which was Sue's point. There is what in a normal scenario, you're just going to have basic language in your report that is in response to what the requirements expect. And so maybe what we need to do, and notwithstanding there were some really good suggestions here that there may be we need to relook at management's responsibilities, and perhaps we haven't quite captured the right ones in there. So we need to look back at part 9 and think about, have we got the right ones there? But maybe let me just step back. We had taken the EER reports that we'd already looked at, well, not everyone, but many of us board members had already looked at and put those in. But maybe we've done this the wrong way around. Maybe what we need to do is the way we do it in the standards, which is keep it very basic. What would absolutely you expect to see? No emphasis of matter, no multidisciplinary teams, none of that information. And then there was also concerns about the way we've described inherent limitations as well. And I can see that now. And the mix up between that and emphasis of matter, I can see that. So I think going forward, what might be useful is that the task force just strip this back to the very basic elements, including having them modified. And then in the hybrid, I still think it's worthwhile taking on Julie's point that let's just make one of those the limited assurance still with metrics. So at least we bring that scenario out, but pull out all the noise and the additional information. We've got the ER guidance. So if anybody needed to think about what else to add into their report, when they're looking at the exposure draft and thinking about the reports, it's there. And of course, we've already said there is a need to develop more illustrations, and we can do that going down into the future. So from what I'm hearing, just some of the concerns that are coming through, including, how the other information is explained as well. That's clearly a nuance we hadn't spotted. So thanks for that. I think we strip it back. We go right back to the basics, and then we worry about what might also be included there and a bit later down the track. And I'm getting lots of nods, but I just think that might be the best way to deal with it. And the only reason I'm raising it now and not mulling over it, and I do need to make sure the task force is on board as well with that, is that we just don't have a lot of time, and we're going to be meeting up next week. So that's the suggestion anyway. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Josephine. And on some of this, we may not need everything in place, as you say, for this educational material by the time of the exposure draft approval. And I think that's something that we should keep in mind. There's someone pointed out to me this concept of we will get input and almost like a form of crowdsourcing some of the educational guidance that is needed over time to accompany the standard. I think one of the things you raise is EER guidance, and we talked about 3410 and how those link into ISSA 5000 and whether they need to be adapted over time or thought about. So I think all of those things play into it. I think we need to get some illustrative examples in. You suggest a slight modified approach for it, but I also don't think we need to have it all perfect by the time we hit June. Yosh?
Thank you, Tom, and thank you very much for the task force and Josephine. It is great work. Just one comment I have. It is assumed that the scope of assurance will vary from contract to contract, especially the voluntary engagement. It is very important for the intended users to make the scope of assurance clear. So it is necessary that certain items in the scope of assurance section should be added as examples explicitly in the assurance report illustration. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Yosh. Wendy?
Thank you, Tom. Couldn't find my unmute button. I wanted to come back in on Josephine's earlier point on modified, and so now that she's revised that, I want to applaud that the second response, because I think that's right on stripping it back, and then of course the EER guidance remains relevant. I did want to weigh in and say we do favor a modified example, so you already confirmed that we should do that in your second comment. And that it should be for scope limitation. That was, if we were choosing between the two, scope limitation was number one for me. So I think that resolves some of the other concerns I had about the examples. And I just want to support Edo's mention of how to make some changes to ISQM1 and the ethics section, how it might, in brackets, look like if it was other than IAASB and ISQM1. Thank you.
Thank you. Fernanda?
Thank you, Tom. And Josephine, we heard very similar comments, but in general, there was strong support for the three documents, taking them as examples or illustrations. And I think people in practice recognize that they would need to be tailored to accommodate the different circumstances. There were a little bit more of questions in terms of a potential example for modified opinion. And I think the comments were split between people having audit background. They felt less concerned with that example because they knew other sources of information where they could go and check what needs to be included. But for the practitioner without that audit background, I think they suggested to at least have one because they would find it very helpful, and maybe a need for developing additional examples outside the standard in either implementation material or educational or guidance as you were suggesting. But I think in general, they felt pretty comfortable with the content of the examples. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernando. Greg?
Thanks, Tom. I largely just want to reinforce the comments that have already been made. So the modified opinion examples, yes, absolutely. The summary of work performed don't need, so agree with those two. I was going to comment on the inherent limitation section, but I think the stripping back idea, Josephine, deals with my worry there. So I think that's a good strategy. Just one thought that maybe hasn't come up yet is just I've always seen the two pillars of ethical requirements and quality management as sitting there. When I look at this illustration, there's no mention on the front of quality management. So I'd just like them to be seen as much as we can right through the standard to give them equal weight, because I think we want to emphasize not only for accountants, but also for non-accountants, the significance of both, and they work together and they underpin all of the work. So it would be good. We don't necessarily have to move the section within the actual report on quality management, but I think that someone may have suggested the geographic move as well. So, but it was more just, at least on the front where we've got the bullet points explaining the circumstances, are we able to at least mention the quality management aspect? But yeah, I think we're getting close. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Last but not least, Eric.
Thanks, Tom, and sorry for coming back in. I was just reflecting, Tom, on your comment earlier about this standard covers attestation engagements, and people that are outside of the profession might not be that familiar with that concept. I wondered whether the assumptions blurbs at the beginning of these examples where we're talking about the engagement could perhaps make it clear that this is an attestation engagement. Management has agreed that it's an attestation engagement and will be making the appropriate assertions that will allow us to conduct it in accordance with 5,000. That was my final comment. Thank you.
Thank you. So I know we touched, this was on B.1, but a lot of these will flow through to all of the examples. But Josephine, you've come in a number of circumstances. Maybe you want to sort of summarize your key takeaways based upon what you've heard.
Yeah, that's fine, of course. And as I say, thanks again for that. But I think in order to address some of these cautions and challenges that have been raised, I think the key, and I got lots of nods at the time, is we'll strip these right back and we'll leave the more extensive scenarios and situations to our non-authoritative guidance, and so we'll think about that. And then in terms of, as I said earlier, there are some suggested enhancements though to management responsibilities, but we have to look to see what we heard from the board in part 9 to see if that works. We will, of course, be happy to bring along a modified example as well. So we'll go for a scope limitation on a limited assurance engagement. Thank you. So we'll do that. There was a suggestion to just shift the position of the quality management references up to or perhaps before management responsibilities. So we'll have a look at that. And then there were some other suggestions to add certain points to the fact pattern at the beginning, but some of those may drop away if we strip things back, but we'll have a look at those as well. So yes, thank you very much. Oh yes, and of course reasonable assurance, we won't be including that either the next time it's said to procedures. Thank you. So I mean, maybe Tom, it would be good to the limited assurance the limited assurance report is the next one, which is B.2.
Any comments specifically to B.2 that haven't been addressed more generally? You know. Oh, you're on mute, Ada.
Again, sorry. At the moment, the limited assurance report, if you put it next to the reasonable assurance report, they look remarkably alike, and which we struggled with. Well, I think it needs to be abundantly clear that this is a different report covering or work performed under a different scope, and I'm trying to think of ways to clarify that to the user. And there's a couple of ideas I had is to early on in the report clarify the scope and include the language "and are substantially less than." So much closer to the conclusion rather than you first need to work through the report. May also be useful to, from there on, point to the summary of work, and I'll come to that in a little bit. Well, let me deal with it now. So I'm just trying to think out of the box here, because as you will also have seen in the combined reports, it feels odd that for a limited assurance report, there's going to be this whole list of procedures that you've done, but it's actually less assurance than in a reasonable assurance report where we're now not going to have the summary of work performed, which I agree with, by the way. And I was thinking, can we maybe turn this around? And it is out of the box and it may be difficult, but would it not be more transparent to the users that in a limited assurance report, we clarify some of the procedures we did not perform? And because the length of the procedures that are not performed are then commensurate with the level of assurance that is not provided. So that's a suggestion in respect of also just making the report feel different from a reasonable assurance report. And yeah, I think the estimates bullet in the practitioner's responsibilities reflects the reasonable assurance responsibilities and not the limited assurance. So it's not in line with 719L as far as I've been able to determine. And I guess, but that comes back to the comment also made in respect of the reasonable assurance report. We may need a little bit less on practitioners' responsibilities in the reasonable assurance report versus the or a little bit less in the limited assurance report versus the reasonable assurance report. But yeah, that's going to be an interplay to the extent that we would disclose procedures that we have not performed relative to a reasonable assurance engagements. I think those are my key points. And Josephine, in light of your request, I will send over today or tomorrow the comments in respect of all these reports in the introduction.
Thank you, Ada. Diane?
Yeah, so my comments are on the example procedures. Again, I think, Ada mentioned the estimates one. I think even the site visits, I think the comment that we tested at each site visit a number of items. I think that's more than most limited assurance reports are doing. I tend to think of them as analytics and inquiries are the biggest concentration of work effort. And I think we have to be really, really careful in these example procedures as to not set the bar too high. Because to me, these read quite a bit like reasonable assurance work product. And so just ask you to take a look at that. And similar to Ada, we've got some comments on the reports and the introduction that we'll send together. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. Josephine, you have your hand up?
Yes, I was going to say, actually, also is to Diane's point. When I was talking about stripping back, I mean for all the reports here. So recognizing that you definitely do still need something in the nature, time, and extent of procedures for limited assurance. And so to Diane's point, we can strip that back and make it a bit more reasonable, no pun intended. Ultimately, we'll do the same across all reports. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. Sachika.
Thank you, Tom. I have 3 comments, and the first one is on the management responsibility section. And in the second bullet, I found there is some inconsistency between this limited assurance report and in the reasonable assurance report in illustration 1. In addition, I look at the description in this illustration 2, this second bullet does not read well for me, since it sounds like management is responsible for describing the XYZ law. So maybe the task force can take a look at the wording between 2 illustrations. And my second comment is on practitioner's responsibility section, and my comment is very similar to what Edo says. I think the third bullet talks about assumption, which is only for reasonable assurance engagement. So maybe we need to take a look at the wordings. And my third comment is also the summary of the work performance section. From the illustrated report, I get an impression that a lot of descriptions are required. And also the illustration include very detailed items, such as the third one, to high-level items, such as the 6th one. So I think it is a bit hard to understand the expected level of description from this illustration. So maybe the task force need to revisit the wordings or have some additional guidance will be helpful. That's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Chawei?
Thanks, Tom. So first of all, on the decision discussed in the earlier section about stripping it back so that our illustration are the bare minimum kind of template, I think that makes sense. But at the same time, my heart sank a little bit because I really like a lot of the examples that are in here. So it's great that the task force has this, are thinking of moving this to educational material. So let's not lose that. I think those are really, really helpful. So just on the practitioner's responsibility, the first paragraph, actually, when we say our objectives are, I thought it reads a little bit odd because it sounds like the practitioner is obtaining limited assurance that nothing has come to their attention. So it doesn't read quite right. And I see that it's not, maybe I'm not sure whether I checked correctly, but it's not quite consistent with the illustration and as a 3410 ER guidance or the illustrations and the review standards. So can the task force maybe just have a look at this paragraph again? It doesn't read, it doesn't flow right for me. And then I have some other comments, but once we strip it out, I think those are no longer relevant, but I'll send them through anyway. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Eric?
Thanks, Tom. I just had maybe a question in that this example is dealing with a general purpose compliance framework. And when I was looking at the requirements in part 9 under 10L, it talks about being in accordance with the criteria and doesn't talk about framework. So I was just wondering if there's an inconsistency between this example and the requirement in part 9. Thank you.
Thank you for highlighting that. Josephine, that's our last of the hands for this limited assurance. I think we heard a few themes, particularly around its proximity to, in terms of design, to reasonable assurance. Was the one I heard that resonated the most, but there were several other comments throughout.
Yeah, and the stripping back, and then we're looking at the wording. But again, and maybe when we start stripping back, some of those issues will actually go away. As I say, I think a lot of the challenges we faced today in this meeting is trying to give you everything, and then actually ultimately what we really did is just the basics. So that's helpful. And then the final one is, of course, the hybrid one. Same applies, and we'll take on board all these comments that you've made on the first two. So if there's anything else that is just relevant to this particular report, that would be great to hear those comments. Thank you, Tom. So that's 1-B3.
Thank you. So we'll go to the last of the examples provided. Anyone?
Sachiko, come on, you must have something for me.
Well, maybe because we addressed so many of it. Wendy, there you go.
Hey.
Was that recognition I should speak?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to say that the reason I wasn't going to continue comments, because my first one really addressed the themes, and I think we've addressed some of the stripping back and, modifications that you suggested are okay. The only thing we didn't talk about was other information. And I couldn't find exactly either in the issues paper or even in part 9 why that needs to be explicitly in the report. So it's more of a question, but I would say that I'm not in favor of including it in the report, because I'm not very clear on why it's needed. That's my only additional comment.
Okay, thank you. Sue?
So I raised the point earlier about the comparison between reasonable and limited here, and I mean we've probably left the task force with some really difficult stuff to think about. And what I really wanted to say is I think this is a really important example for us to include. It is real life, and I know sometimes when we're looking at stuff, and particularly with the time scale, it's tempting to say, actually, do we really need this? Should we just drop it? And I just want to say I think this is worth the time and effort to try and get something that is helpful, and at least get feedback on it as well.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Josephine?
Okay, so that's great. We on this hybrid one that I did get nods when we took on Julie's suggestion to maybe change one of the points, which is on the limited assurance, to make that about metrics, just to bring that piece alive a little bit, although it will strip back a bit, but I'm sure that piece which should still survive. On other information, Wendy, is part of the requirements, and it's part of our foundation that when you have a responsibility as an auditor to actually review, using loose terms here, the other information, that we should be transparent about it in our report, and that cuts across our audit and our assurance work. So that was agreed by the board a while back. So I'm sorry, it's going to be one of your bugbears, I can tell.
And I'll send in some editorials on it.
So and we do need to deal with that nuance that was raised around management isn't responsible for the audit report. So that's a bit of a scratchy head one, that one. Now Tom, we still need to deal with the board's feedback if they have any other comments on those paragraphs in the issues paper. So now some of this may not happen now, taking into account that we'll be stripping back, but generally on the whole, we were talking about paragraphs 12, B all the way through to 13C, but primarily in 13, there are some clarifications that we'll need to do as well to the report. Now, it's hard because some of these things will go away now that we're stripping it back. But just generally, what might be useful to hear is if any of the board members felt strongly against any of the suggestions. And so even if they disappear, we just know that we can keep that in mind when we're talking about this at the task force meeting. So that's the last piece. So it's 12B all the way through to 13C. And if the board members have any strong objections to us pursuing some of these matters. Thank you.
Thank you. Any specific comments? So we're going down to, this is really sort of, if you go to the issues paper, 12 and 13. I think people are busy looking at their notes. The focus was on the illustrative examples.
No, I think we're probably
Okay. I think you're fine there. I think people are going to want to digest what comes back in the next iteration, following sort of the stripping back.
Yeah. And also in the, we can also talk about in the explanatory memorandum, we can remind practitioners and non-practitioners of the guidance that is there. So when they're looking at exposure draft, they can also look at the ER guidance and also think about developing other illustrations for the future. But that concludes my agenda item 1, other than to thank board members for all their fantastic comments today. That's been incredibly helpful and will really help us move forward. And looking forward to task force meeting next week and ironing all this out. Thank you.
So I just want to ask the board if there's anything else they'd like to raise on the substance of the sustainability topic. For you, Josephine, is it really what's the deadline for submitting comments to be practical for your task force?
Well, we're not going to be able to cover everything immediately at once or next week. So, we understand that people need to reflect on their comments as well. But if we could have everything by Monday, that would be great. Thank you. And as I say, thanks to those who've already sent in their comments as well. I appreciate that. Okay.
This has been a robust discussion. I think we've made good headway on both the introduction and the illustrative examples. I don't know, this is probably a good point to have some reflections from Janine or Jim, if either of them would like to come in.
Tom, I'll be happy to come in.
Thank you, Jim.
And I think some of my comments are reflective of the conversation we've had today. So, but I do want to point out that within the CAG, there was considerable discussion about limited assurance, and the argument is many of these engagements may start as limited assurance, but the differentiation between limited and a reasonable assurance and the risk of, I would say, issues within the readers of the report understanding what exactly has been done was a discussion point at the CAG, and I think it's relevant to bring up again. And then the second is the issue of ISQM and the intersection of that with some of the because it is an assurance engagement and just the reflection on that for practitioners. Because if you go into the quality standards, it does talk about the firm, and you might have a non-traditional structure if it's a practitioner. So those are the two I'd like to highlight. Thank you.
Thank you. Janine?
Yes, thank you so much. Yes, I'd like to make some remarks, give some recommendations. First, to start with, that I think it was a very good discussion on the introduction and examples of assurance reports today, and I'd like to commend the task force and board for producing at fast pace a full draft of ISA 5000. And I would like to raise a few comments and recommendations in view of public interest issues on behalf of the PIOB for your further consideration. Regarding the introduction, I'd like to start with reiterating what I said at the March meeting and what was also discussed today, being a continued focus on clarity of language, terminology, and definitions, which is key particularly for non-professional accountants, and the description of sustainability information in the introduction is more inclusive than the definition discussed in March, as it now refers to ESG matters and to the double materiality. We recommend further work on that using clear and non-technical language in cooperation with IAASB to achieve consistent terminology and definitions. And as also being discussed by the board today, and as I raised in March, also regarding ethical requirements and a system of quality management, which was also discussed by the CAG, the code and the framework, the quality management framework being at least as demanding as the I like to reiterate that a balance needs to be found on what would be reasonable to require for assurance providers who are not professional accountants to ensure, on the one hand, a level playing field, and at the same time, not to raise a non-proportionate hurdle which would prevent adoption of ISA 5000 by non-professional accountants. And there is, in my view, a need to be clearer on certain key minimum requirements or concepts that would be expected from at least as demanding codes and quality management frameworks, and further exploring other existing codes and frameworks for quality management to provide further guidance in the standards is, I think, a good way forward. And regarding the difference between limited and reasonable assurance in terms of work effort needed, but also the reliance that is being put on it, also what was discussed at the CAG, as I understood, as well as limitations in limited assurance compared to reasonable assurance. This should become very clear from the assurance reports, and it would be helpful to provide more guidance on that in general, I think, in the application material of the standard as well. So it should be clear in the assurance reports, but of course it should also be made provide much more guidance, I think, for in particular also, again, the non-professional accountants to have that included in the application material. And we support modified assurance report examples to be added, particularly so you can obtain feedback when exposing the draft ISA 5000, which is important, I think. And in line with the IAASB's decision in March not to include key audit matters in the assurance reports, the examples you discussed today, they indeed do not contain such paragraphs. We would like to reiterate that it would be useful to include CAM for PIs in the assurance reports so that assurance providers may provide further insight about significant risks assessed and difficult areas encountered while performing the engagement. But of course, we also understand the decision that was taken by the board, but therefore it would be good, I think, to specifically ask feedback on not including CAM when exposing the draft standard for the time being, as I understood that this would be a next step for the boards to further work on after ISA 5000 would be finalized. So those were my observations and comments, and thank you very much. And good luck with the continued work on ISA 5000. So thanks.
Thank you, Janine. Any other comments on the substance of the discussion today? I think we should just, at this moment, before we close the discussion out, is at the end of our March meeting, Josephine reported back to the public session our administrative discussion on timelines. Since at that point, we just decided that we were going to discuss the potential and the potential value in our approach to mitigating any risk of advancing our comment period and consultation process to start in July and to extend into December, which would require a June approval of the exposure draft. Since that date, I have spoken to the PIOB. The PIOB hosted a discussion, a forum on our sustainability work and IAASB's work. We've had numerous discussions with IAASB. Staff continues to coordinate with IAASB staff on the list of issues to address. I've spoken to a number of the monitoring group members as well. I have done significant stakeholder outreach, most recently in Japan last week. Through all those discussions, we've received encouragement to pursue that advanced timetable for consultation, with the assumption that we'll do significant outreach work during the period and very much focus on our coordination efforts with IAASB. Based upon the discussion today, it's my personal point of view that there's no reason to delay our consideration of the ED in June, and that we should go ahead with our original intention. And today on this board session, I'd like to confirm that intention. If so, and once we confirm it, we would publish something publicly, either later this week or early next week, to confirm this, so we alerted stakeholders that something is coming and that they could start preparing their resources to participate in our consultation process. Maybe with that in mind, before I get the affirmation of this board or any concerns, that I'd ask anyone to speak up and reaction. Maybe Josephine, you're probably first on behalf of the task force to assess what I just said. Certainly, I've been in touch with you and the team on this, and nothing. So what I'm saying is not a surprise.
Yeah, no, that's right. And, you know, what's been useful between now and March is the outreach that you've done and continued points with other board members, just to confirm that everyone's still comfortable with us taking this faster track and being more agile. But yes, certainly, as I said in my opening remarks, I do feel like we're in really good shape. It's a lot of hard work, including from our board members, but we're all getting there. And, you know, we're excited to get the exposure draft out the door, and we really do need that feedback from our stakeholders and practitioners, non-practitioners. And the sooner we get it out there and get that feedback and give them the time that they really need to absorb the information and help us drive this forward to a final standard, the better. So yeah, personally, team and I fully support the direction. Yeah.
Thank you, Josephine. Janine, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I don't know if you or the PIB wants to add any perspective onto what I said. Obviously, I was with the PIOB just a few weeks ago, and we discussed this. But if there was any perspective you wanted to provide before I asked the board to affirm our intention.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, I think you said the most important things. It was, of course, also already in the paper that you prepared with the risks in it. And at the PIOB meeting, we discussed, the coordination that is important with IAASB, of course, continued coordination, intensified coordination, versus that at the time the timelines are different. But we really also see the real importance of being timely with this project. That's really a key success factor for this project. So looking at the risks, the risk of not meeting the market's expectations is higher and cannot be overcome with anything else. So it's better now to advance this if possible. And what I hear, it is possible. And the task force is ready for taking on this and continue to do this challenge to work as hard as possible on this project. So then for the PIOB, we support this approach, and we of course also rely on that you really work closely together with the IAASB going forward, as you already do now. So from our side, there is no other argument to take into consideration, as already been said by Tom in his introduction to this topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Janine. Okay, I'll invite any comment if anyone wants to add anything to what I said or has any questions. Okay, and no hands are being raised. So could I just confirm that the board is happy to move ahead with using our June meeting for the approval of the ED? This means we'll get a review of the initial review of the drafts, and then the week following, we will likely do the ultimate approval of the ED via a virtual conference call. Okay, that I'll take that as full support. Let the record note. So we're going for a June approval of our ISSA 5000. First of all, thank you to the task force for making, and the staff and the drafting team for making that possible. It's only because of your work that we could get this done, and for the board for the really valuable comments. So I do want to thank everyone involved with this meeting for making it happen and all the work. There's a lot of work ahead. We're going to need everyone's help. And when we get to consultation phase and our outreach phase, it will be all hands on deck too. So we intend to use all of you in the outreach phase, because this is going to be the biggest outreach effort we've ever needed to get the standard in good order. Draft minutes for this meeting, as well as our March meeting, will be distributed in due course, and we'll we'll approve them at our June meeting. One thing to note is on June 15th, under the existing terms of our board, we need to run the ED by the CAG. So we're going to have an impromptu and sort of an ad hoc CAG session on June 15th to go over the sustainability draft with them. The last CAG in its current form will be in person in New York on September 12th and 13th. We will inform those who need to be part of it shortly. Just a reminder, again, our board meeting is a 4-day meeting, Tuesday to Friday in New York, June 20th to 23rd, and then a follow-up on the 28th for the approval. You've received some materials already. Agenda will be communicated shortly. Remember to register for that meeting by May 19th. Just with that, I thank you for your continued efforts in support of our work. Thanks all the public observers who are on this call, and I will look forward to speaking to everyone shortly. Thank you, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you. Bye.